name is Haley Pickard, and this is Teague Campbell, as well as Jeff Kitchaven, commercial mediator, and William Bulfer. Thank you for joining us today. Bill and Jeff, take it away.
Well, thank you, Haley, and thanks all of you who are here. The screen is quite intimidating with the number of squares that I can't even see and don't even know who's watching. This is a first for our insurance coverage services team here at Teague Campbell. And when Raven and Haley were like, well, you guys got to get out there and go do something, if I'm honest about it, I sort of took the easy way out. I've had enough late night tacos and taxi rides with Jeff Kitchaven that I knew if I just got him on a Zoom with me and we started talking about mediation, that hour would go by pretty darn quickly. But in all seriousness, you have a great sort of co-presenter here today in Jeff. His insight into the profession and into some tricks of the trade are going to be great. And beyond that, just the faces I'm seeing in the signups and in the squares here, to the extent that any of you have anything to offer, I think we really could benefit from this being a conversation today. You'll see the PowerPoint. I think it's on your screen right at this point, and what you'll see is some black letter, what we'll call guideposts along the way. But as exciting as it is to just have us read a PowerPoint, we thought that probably wasn't the best route to go. So as we're going through this presentation a little bit today, you'll basically see a backdrop, but the real value is in the conversation we can have and some of the insight that we'll learn from questions that may be asked in the chat box and also just experiences that can be shared. A little bit of information for those of you guys who don't know who the heck we are. My name is Bill Bulfer. I'm co-chair of our firm's insurance coverage services team. Jeff, if you want to say a couple of words about yourself, aside from tacos and taxi cabs, I'm sure that would be great as well.
Thank you so much, Bill. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this wonderful webinar. Thanks to your terrific team at Teague Campbell. It's an honor to be invited here to present alongside you. I'm an independent mediator in private practice. I've been a full-time mediator for 25 years now, and I love doing insurance coverage cases. Insurance is an acquired taste for those of us who are in law, and I've acquired the taste. I find it intellectually challenging. I find the people interesting. I tend to get along well with almost all the people who do insurance coverage law. And of course, it's important not only to insurance carriers, but also to the policyholders and to the third-party plaintiffs, that these claims be resolved as efficiently and economically as possible. To the extent that we in the mediation profession can assist in that, it's a good day. Happy to be here with you. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Jeff. If I could ask one favor of the entire group as we work through this agenda, and that is truly, this is the first time that we've done this, that we've offered CLE across the country, that we've reached out to folks who may benefit from it. We would absolutely love your feedback at the end of it, good, bad, or ugly. Everybody will be getting a copy of the PowerPoint. If there are tweaks we can make in the future, or if there are topics that you all think would be beneficial to hear from, if you just think it's a terrible idea altogether, any of that information is what we need to be able to sort of continue this outreach and do it as best we can. Truly, we are grateful for the number of people that have signed up to walk through this with us, because it's been an odd year and a half at this point. And just getting a chance to even see some of you on Zoom or know that you're out there connecting is it's certainly meaningful from where we're sitting. So as we work into this, let's just sort of head into it. And these are the three sort of main topics that we thought as we sat down and talked about what to do about mediating cases where coverage were an issue. These are our three main guideposts that we really want to get into today. The first and sort of simplest portion of this is just understanding the context of what you're dealing with when it comes to insurance coverage. Now, we're not going to talk to you guys about the basics, but understanding the basics and how they fit into any disputed litigation is really going to be critical, because at the end of the day, you can have a case you're going to win, you can have a case you're going to lose, but if you don't know where the money's coming from if you do lose, it really doesn't matter. And ultimately, the question of money most of the time boils down to the availability of insurance. even when the answer to that question is there is no insurance, that question needs to be answered for people to have a practical understanding of what is available to them. And, I think I just kind of wanted to start in our conversation, Jeff, with seeing what you've experienced. Do people come into mediated settlement conferences with a real understanding of insurance issues, or do you feel like folks are still pecking around in the dark a little bit?
One of the real challenges, Bill, this very important topic, is that so often the third-party plaintiffs come into the mediation of these liability cases without much understanding of not only the particular insurance issues involved in this case, but also the whole insurance landscape, what the defendant's insurance program looks like, how most often it's CGL policies, how CGL policies really work, the whole structure of it. And so in those cases, one of the challenges is to figure out what is the best way to help third-party plaintiffs and their lawyers understand all the dynamics of the behind-the-scenes negotiation going on between the insurance carrier and the policyholder. From the third-party plaintiff's perspective, it's a sad truth, but the truth is that when there is that behind-the-scenes dispute between the policyholder and the carrier, it almost never results in more money being made available to the third-party plaintiff. And making sure that those plaintiffs understand the true practicalities, the true realities of the situation is essential to getting a case settled. So much of what we'll be discussing in this hour is what is the appropriate role of insurance carriers in that process of working the issues out not only with their policyholder, but also what role does the insurance carrier and its representatives play in terms of the across the table, shall we call it, negotiation between the third-party plaintiff and the defense side. There's no one size fits all. It's subtle, it's nuanced, and I look forward to discussing some of the considerations in greater depth with you.
It's interesting, Jeff, as we work sort of through the issue of what is available for insurance and how we convey that information to the interested parties, there's so much to think about. You get in these cases where people are emotionally invested. They're invested in a way that either they've had a loved one who's been harmed, they have a loss that they've experienced, or on the defense side, they've been sued for reasons that somebody doesn't agree with. On the insurer side, perhaps there are issues that they're contending with. But working to help all of the parties really understand the practical implications of what is at issue, I've started to find has some real benefit in helping cases get resolved. Everything from really awful use of force cases where you've got somebody who is either catastrophically injured or even dead at certain points, but helping the family who's grieving understand that fighting for the next 3 years isn't going to A, bring their loved one back, but B, necessarily realize any financial gain given the real insurance coverage issues that are at play. What has your experience been in terms of the utility of insurance professionals in that dynamic? So, I know a lot of times you end up with mediations where you have the plaintiff's lawyer and you have the defense lawyer. Are you seeing the increased involvement in insurance professionals, coverage lawyers to really help inform that dialogue?
Bill, that's such an important issue, the issue of people's emotions and how we deal with them, and what role the people from representing insurance carriers can play in dealing with some of these emotional issues. First of all, we have to recognize that emotional issues are always at play. While at one level it's always about the money, there's another level at which it's always about more than the money. Every one of our brains is generating emotional responses and reactions to things all the time. We can't help it. It's like our sense of hearing. We can't turn it off the way we can turn off our sense of sight if we shut our eyes. So recognizing that these emotions are always at play, and the insurance representatives can play a role in this. If you're the person who's been injured, who's been wrongfully incarcerated, who's lost a limb in an auto accident or some other sort of accident, or lost a financial opportunity in a business case. There is a loss there with which you're dealing, and there's a degree of empathy and connection which is going to help get that case settled. So often the insurance company is demonized, sometimes in the eyes of the policyholder and many times in the eyes of the third-party plaintiff. You don't read a lot of good things about big multinational insurance companies in the press, let's face it. So when the person from the insurance company, the representatives of the insurance company show up, they're flesh and blood living human beings. They have moms and dads, they have children, they have spouses, they have emotions too. And one thing that everybody can do when you're dealing with a third-party plaintiff or their family members who are grieving a loss is you can just establish some kind of human connection. And you can do this, Bill, without admitting any kind of liability. It can be as simple as saying, Mr. and Ms. So-and-so, I'm so sorry for your loss. Just that's not an admission of any kind of liability. It's simply an acknowledgement of human connection here. If you don't know what to say, one thing that often works is if you're prepared to say, I can't possibly imagine what it's like to be you right now. That is a statement with which, it's very hard to disagree with that statement. How can anybody say, oh, you're wrong, you do understand exactly what it's like to be me right now? That would be ridiculous. But if you can say something, put something out there which is true and sincere and tries to get a bit of human connectedness going and allows somebody to agree with you about something, such as that magic statement, I can't possibly imagine what it's truly like to be you right now. That's the way to reduce the demonization of insurance carriers. And when you're dealing with human beings and not imaginary demons, then you can get down to what the real issues are in the case. Insurance is a contract. It covers certain risks and it doesn't cover other risks. It covers risks that arise during certain periods of time and not other periods of time. All of these sorts of issues that are critical to coverage and how much money the carrier will or will not put up to settle the case. If you can establish that human connectedness, it's a lot easier then to have subsequent conversations with that third-party plaintiff about, what is it really realistic to expect the insurance carrier to put into this case, given the constraints of its coverage?
Well, it's interesting. As we're talking about this and I'm watching the slides go by, what I realize is on some level, they don't relate at all to what we're talking about. On the other hand, they're directly in line with what you're just talking about, because things like the duty to defend, like the duty to indemnify, are very sort of basic concepts that we get engrossed in when we're looking at insurance coverage, but are challenging to humanize it at some point or at some level. The flip side of that is they are sort of your keys to relatability if you are on the insurance side of these. And I can't tell you how many times I've been in a mediation and I've sat down across from somebody who's angry or who's grieving, and as the insurance coverage lawyer in the room, I can say, look, it's not my job to disagree with your allegations. But what I can tell you is what will happen if those allegations are proven to be true, and the practical impact of those allegations on your ability to actually have something come out of this that is good. Oftentimes, their realization of that sort of juxtaposition between what they think has happened, which is wrong, and what it means for their actual ability to coverage is what allows that gap to be bridged. There are cases where the allegations or the nature of the harm complained of are just unrecoverable, whether it's because you have certain immunities that apply or the nature of the allegations are so intentional that it would never be covered by any measure of insurance. And finding that human point of connection where you can look at someone and say, but today you can make a difference out of this. Today you can have some measure of resolution that is different than doing everything you say you're going to do and then spend the next 2 years fighting about whether it matters financially.
These are very sound points, and let's take one step back. What you're assuming in that conversation is that it's the representative of the insurance company who's speaking, communicating directly with the third-party plaintiff or at least with their lawyer. And that can be a big deal. Many representatives of insurance carriers are reluctant to engage in that kind of direct communication, and for some sound reasons. They're concerned they may inadvertently be creating some kind of exposure for bad faith in the claims handling if they say the wrong thing or to the wrong person. And mediation can be, there are things we can do about that in mediation, particularly in California where I live. We have case White versus Western Title, which many insurance representatives believe create that risk. And many people representing the lawyers for insurance carriers have what they call a white waiver, where they get the third-party plaintiff to sign an acknowledgement that they will not use evidence of anything said in the mediation to establish bad faith or in any subsequent litigation against the insurance carrier. And generally speaking, counsel for third-party plaintiffs will advise their clients to sign that white waiver to allow the conversation to go ahead. Why is it beneficial? It can be beneficial because the representatives of the insurance company are, in a sense, they're the new kids on the block. They're the new participants in the conversation. The defense counsel has been the one in the trenches with that third-party plaintiff. They've been taking the depositions. Those are usually kind of antagonistic. The defense counsel has been writing briefs with perhaps some antagonistic or inflammatory language. And the defense counsel can become a lightning rod for animosity and antagonism emanating from that third-party plaintiff. When the insurance company representatives come on the scene at a mediation, well, they haven't been involved. They haven't been in the trenches. They haven't been in the day-to-day, hand-to-hand combat of litigation. And so sometimes these messages are received better when they're delivered by the insurance representatives who have not been the ones building up those layers and layers of animosity along the way. And also, as you correctly pointed out, the insurance representatives can say, they're not really involved in whether the allegations are true or not, or whether the damages are realistic or unrealistic. They're just here to look at the contractual obligations of the insurance company under the circumstances. And when you separate it from the plaintiff and their own experiences and their own conduct that way, it can be easier for the insurance representatives to be the ones involved in delivering that bad news.
This is sort of where we transition a little bit from what we were talking about in terms of that relatability and the ability to help people understand insurance and what it means for the substantive handling of a mediation. Once you actually reach people and you get to the point where they're thinking critically about what measure of protection is there, you can really open the door to alternative strategies, whether it's direct payment by other parties, by folks who are questioning their own insurance construct, from third-party resources altogether. And sometimes it's not even money. I'll remember, probably the last liability case I handled, we were about $500,000 apart on a pretty bad wrongful death case involving a claimed faulty intubation of a patient. And the reality is we were going to win that case. We had governmental immunity. We had defenses that were going to leave this mother who was grieving without anything. But she was understandably frustrated and entrenched in her position on a certain dollar amount. And so we hung about $500,000 apart. And ultimately, what we were able to do to resolve the case was to reassure her that the way that procedure was being done after her daughter died was changing. And it wouldn't be done that way again. And she came back into the room with tears in her eyes and asked us to rename the procedure after her daughter, which we politely refused to do. But that sort of human connection and ability to offer something else besides money to resolve that case is ultimately what allowed the process to take place. That wouldn't have been possible without what Jeff was talking about, without the ability to talk about things like an immunity exclusion in a policy and the fact that it allows a governmental entity to essentially get out of jail free. So the ability to really have somebody in the room to not only understand the liability risks, but also the recoverability risks for the plaintiff is critical. What are you seeing on that front, Jeff? Do you see a shift in your practice when folks finally get that there are questions or concerns about coverage, and are people thinking creatively?
Getting people to think creatively, Bill, is one of the mediator's most important obligations. You know, in good mediation, we help other people negotiate to their highest capacity as well as they humanly can. In bad mediation, the mediator hijacks the role of the lawyers and their clients and negotiates for them. And let me explain in a little more detail how that might come up in the kind of situation you're talking about with the medical procedure. So the hospital is now doing medical procedures differently. Compare and contrast this in your own mind. Mediator trundles down the hall or breakout room in the online era and goes to the family and says, you know, they don't do the procedure the same way anymore. They have a completely different method of doing it, and they've changed as a result of what happened in this situation. That's okay. Now consider scenario B, where that same message is delivered not by the mediator, but by your client or by the hospital administrators or the doctors. If they come in and themselves say, you know, as a result of what we've learned from this experience, we now do this procedure differently. Try to envision in your own mind which is going to have a greater impact on that family. To me, I think it's obvious. The mediator cannot possibly deliver the message with the same sincerity, the same depth, the same emotion, the same conviction as the people who are directly involved. And so in mediation, for many years, we've gotten away from direct communication. I think this is a trend all over the country in favor of the mediator just running shuttle diplomacy back and forth. And in the online era, it's actually a little easier, I think, to reverse that, because you're no longer in what I now call the Coliseum-like environment of the conference room, where everybody's sitting like a gladiator around that table in their blue suit, white shirt, yellow tie, and equivalent formal business attire for the women who are there. We're at home, you know. It's a lot harder to get agitated when your dog is sitting next to you, or when your kids are in the hallway, or when your cat jumps up onto the keyboard of the computer. The people who speak in online mediation, in my experience, by and large, tend to be less antagonistic, less inflammatory when they speak. And the people who are listening tend to get inflamed and antagonized less easily because they're in the comfort of their home environment, by and large. So we can have more of these direct conversations, and they're going to have greater impact on the people whom you're trying to persuade, the third-party plaintiffs themselves and their lawyers. So don't be afraid of direct communication. If you're concerned about the white versus Western title issues, get the waiver, get the white waiver. Don't be afraid to engage in these kinds of direct conversations, because the impact, the sincerity, the emotion, the conviction with which you will deliver these messages will be much greater than if you simply delegate the mediator we're not living through the situations the way you are. Something, Bill, that I think is actually changing in the online environment. And while there are many trade-offs in the online environment, this, I think, is a change for the better.
The one positive that I've seen come out of COVID in this environment is the injection of grace into people's sort of perspectives, whether it comes from the dog barking in the background or birds chirping because you're stuck on the front porch. You know, the humanization of your adversaries has been largely disarming, which is yet another fortunate transition, because the next topic that we were just hoping to talk about is, you know, what if the dispute on an insurance issue and who's going to pay isn't between the person that you're across the V from, but a co-insurer or somebody who is, you know, working for another insurer and may have a different perspective than you about who's paying what or where or when. It's interesting because oftentimes I find those fights to be almost more contentious than the ones for the people who have actually been harmed. What's your experience been?
I think you're right, Bill. I think that there are many mediations in which figuring out about how much money the plaintiff needs is relatively easy. Figuring out who's going to pay it is a big challenge. And you might have a dispute between a policyholder and the carrier. You might have disputes between primary and excess carriers. You may have disputes between carriers in different policy years, all of these sorts of things. And you've usually got very sophisticated lawyers representing all these different insurance carriers, and those are challenging. Those are challenging negotiations. Part of what you need to do in that case, first of all, if you can work that out in advance between multiple carriers, that is great. There have been a handful of instances when I have been called in to do sort of a preliminary mediation between many insurance carriers. And the things that we are negotiating there is, for example, where's the first $1 million going to come from? And how low does the plaintiff have to get in their demand before the first $1 million is triggered? And then where is the next $1 million going to come from? Which of many carriers? And if you can work those things out in advance, that's great, because then you avoid the situation where mediator works and struggles and puts in a lot of effort to get the third-party plaintiff down to a demand low enough that the carriers say, okay, this is a low enough, it's still way high, but it's low enough that we really got to get to work. A terrible thing is when demand comes across the table and then we start having to cobble together an offer, how much is coming from the policyholder and carrier 1 and carrier 2 and carrier 3. Meantime, the poor third-party plaintiff is sitting there. They've made what they think is a reasonable demand, and it's taking hours for the defense side to come up with an offer that they know is not going to be accepted. It's too low to be accepted, but still there's a lot of effort put into it. If you can work those things out in advance, that's great. In the handful of cases where I've done these preliminary planning mediations among many carriers, I have then not served as the mediator of the underlying liability claim. And it's appropriate that I not serve as the mediator of the underlying liability claim, because I know too much about defense negotiation strategy. It's not in anybody's interest to have the same mediator. But let's say you don't have the ability to work out the coverage issues and various contribution issues among multiple carriers in advance, then we should at least make sure that the third-party plaintiff knows that this is what's going on, because we don't want there to be surprises on the mediation day. And if in fact it's going to be a slower than expected process, mediations are slow processes anyway much of the time. If it's going to be slower than expected, then please flag these issues for the mediator sufficiently in advance of the mediation so that we can tell the plaintiff's lawyer, look, there are these issues. Here's what the issue is, whatever it happens to be. The existence of this issue is going to make the negotiation on the defense side of the table slower than it would otherwise be. You know, in the old days, circa 2019, when people would come to our offices, or we would go to their offices, we would tell people, bring reading material, have other work, you know, bring your iPad or your laptop, do other things. Now, of course, it's kind of easier. Again, when people are at home, they multitask. We know they multitask, and that's okay. And when people are tipped off in advance, prepared for the slow pace, helps us make a deal.
So, you know, while we're talking about sort of the interaction between different insurers and whatnot, and it's interesting, Jeff, you were the first mediator I've heard that suggested a different mediator for, you know, one side of it and the other, but there's a lot of merit to that discussion. It helps you to focus, it helps you avoid potential conflicts. You know, it's something I think we should all really be considering. The other thing that I've seen at times, because you are so, it is so important for what we call touches to take place, for people to actually feel heard and engaged in mediation is, you know, if you've got a big enough issue where you're going to have those gaps in time, consider using 2 mediators at the same time. We've had cases where that has worked wonderfully. Now, lawyers, I know everybody's shocked to hear this, sometimes have a bit of an ego, and finding 2 folks who want to serve in that role at the same time in the same way collaboratively can be hard. But if you find the right pair, it really can sort of be a nice sort of orchestrated way of making sure that the connection points are being made, but also that progress is being made where it is. I don't know, have you ever had that experience, Jeff?
Bill, I don't have much experience co-mediating, so I'll ask you a question. What are the circumstances that make you think it's usually hard enough to convince people to hire 1 mediator? Now you're asking them to hire 2. What are the circumstances that make it uniquely appropriate to have 2 mediators? And how do you ensure that the mediators are actually coordinated with each other and not stepping on each other's toes?
Interesting. In my experience, the ways that it has worked well are in cases where, it's a big enough issue, right? Either the risk is big enough, the number of parties are big enough, the number of issues are big enough, that you can justify the expense to everybody along the way. The other side of it is, and I think this is in some way a benefit of working in a small town like Asheville, you got to find 2 folks who know and like each other and who genuinely will sort of let somebody run lead and let somebody else have a support role. Because if you just go to 2, random attorneys who don't know each other, who have their own ways of handling mediation, you're going to run into a lot of conflict along the way. But if you have 2 people who know and respect each other, who've maybe used one another as a mediator in their own private practice, and who can really sort of put that hierarchy aside in a way that works collaboratively. The experience I have, and I've actually seen one of the clients that was involved with it on the video here, we were able to resolve a case that had 22 plaintiffs and a little girl who lost one of her legs with some really serious attendant coverage issues. And every single one of those plaintiffs and plaintiffs' attorneys was brought to the bargaining table and resolved that overarching risk. And I just don't think it would have been done without the ability for at least one of those mediators to constantly be going back to those families and letting them know all, not the details of the fights we were having, but that those other fights that were being had on things like insurance and immunity and the like were a necessary part of their claim. So it did, I was really impressed, and I can't take credit for that. That was actually the mediator that was selected in that case knew enough about his own limitations in a room like that to suggest bringing somebody else on board, which helped with the hierarchy part of it. And it also gave everybody some confidence that that was the right decision because the person that we had selected and known and trusted was asking for it as well. The one thing that I kept sort of having jump into the back of my mind as you were talking about preparation and insurance-specific mediation is how many times I'm shocked to walk into a mediation where folks haven't done their homework, where they don't know if there's another policy that may be out there to help resolve the risk, or they just submitted a claim to their insurer the day before or the day after a $24 million demand was offered and a day before the mediation took place. And you're sitting there thinking nobody in their right mind is going to be able to pivot and resolve that risk at a mediation. One of the things that I've not yet been able to figure out is, whose job is it? Whose job is it to figure out what the insurance landscape is, to have that conversation, to have those discussions beforehand or during a mediation? I think it's because I talk too much, but a lot of times it ends up being me saying, hey, time out, everybody. What are we doing? What do we need to resolve before we can get to the end? Are you seeing people more prepared in that sense, or are you still surprised from time to time?
Well, I think, sophisticated plaintiffs' lawyers understand insurance issues. Oftentimes before a mediation, they'll serve those interrogatories requesting information about insurance coverage to make sure that at the mediation, everybody is brought to the table. The sophisticated plaintiffs' lawyers, they craft their pleadings many times to trigger coverage. They put in that defamation cause of action. Occasionally, they'll craft their pleadings so as to prevent there from being coverage. Sometimes there might be a reason for that. So it's really the success of the mediation is really everybody's responsibility. And so, for example, if you're a policyholder, a defendant, and you're the policyholder, well, it's your responsibility to understand your insurance program and to tender to all carriers who are potentially on the risk, and to make sure, as a policyholder, you want money from all these folks. So making sure that they have proper notice of the mediation, perhaps input into the selection of the mediators. Many insurance companies make book on mediators. They keep databases of mediators. So the insurance companies, particularly if you're litigating in a jurisdiction where you're not all that familiar, the insurance carrier may have more experience than you in that jurisdiction. And of course, in the online era, geography is no longer as limiting a factor as it used to be in the selection of mediators. So it used to be that you'd want a mediator who's in the jurisdiction because you're there. But now, if you need a mediator who's really got expertise in subject X, or really knows, even more importantly, knows how to deal with a particular kind of personality, and you say, mediator X in Seattle would just be the perfect person to deal with these personalities. Well, now you can get mediator X from Seattle and convince mediator X to wake up a couple of hours early to deal with you guys in the Eastern time zone, which any good mediator will do. And you can have your dream mediator. You're no longer constrained by geography. So that's something else to keep in mind in terms of who your mediator is going to be, and enrolling the mediator and making sure that all these issues are surfaced before the mediation day, so that when you actually get to the mediation day, you hit the ground running as fast as you can.
It's interesting. For so long, when you talk about selection of mediators, you get that sort of local vibe, and who works well with this plaintiff's lawyer and who does, knows this jurisdiction and whatnot. And there certainly, I think, is some value to that. But the flip side of what we've been talking about today is the sort of ability to relate to the people that you're negotiating with, and the way, the ability to explain to them that you're taking their case as seriously as they are. And there's one of the ways you can actually do that is to say, hey, this is important enough to us that we went and got a mediator from California or from New York or from wherever. And yeah, it's going to cost us a little bit more, or it's going to be somebody that none of us are as familiar with, but this is the person that's going to help us get the job done, and that is what is important to us. And that sort of outreach and connection, is just another way of sort of finding a point where you switch the narrative to a collaborative one rather than an adversarial one.
And Bill, let me make a comment on selection of mediators and the importance of the question, do I think the mediator is going to get on wavelength with everybody involved in this case? When people have successful established mediation practices, they're above the line, they're established mediators, it's not that hard to get up to speed on a particular case. Good lawyers give us good briefs, and they can tell us about the law of jurisdiction X, what exactly are the contours of bad faith in jurisdiction X. It differs somewhat from state to state across the country. But it's not hard for a mediator who's generally familiar with the terrain of coverage law to understand, oh, okay, in North Carolina, you have to prove this, and in Georgia, you have to prove that, and in Idaho, you have to prove something else. It's not that hard. We also, good mediators understand, particularly if your cases are in federal court, the standard for summary judgment is X. And if there are local nuances in terms of what it takes to get summary judgments, again, you can educate mediators as to that. We've all been involved, all good established mediators have been involved in looking at those kinds of issues for years and years and years. What really makes a difference is, can the mediator get on wavelength with me, with my client, with the opposing lawyer, with the opposing party's client? Because let's face it, at the end of the day, the mediator is going, in so many cases, is going to be asking the insurance company to pay a little more to get the darn thing over with, and asking the plaintiff to take a little less to get the darn thing over with. That's what we do. If you feel the mediator is just, oh, this mediator is just never going to get on wavelength with my client, the vibe is missing, then it doesn't matter if that mediator wrote the treatise on your particular subject of law. you don't catalyze settlements by forcing people to do things. You catalyze settlements by creating the space and the environment where people feel comfortable doing things. And that requires mediators establishing a certain amount of chemistry and rapport with people. So you should take as an assumed fact that mediators are going to be reasonably up to speed on the factual and legal issues and be able to participate intelligently in conversations of the factual and legal issues. The real acid test question is, will this mediator be able to help me convince my client to pay a little more or take a little less, if that's what it comes down to at the 11th hour?
And meeting people where they're at, which, the elephant in a room like this is that we are largely insurance professionals on some level or another, and bad faith looms large in a lot of jurisdictions. Now, this is not obviously a presentation on bad faith, but the other thing that a good mediator can do is it can help, it will allow that person to understand that concern and to really sort of meet insurance companies where they're at and also plaintiffs where they're at and navigate those often murky waters of bad faith and concern in a way that helps everybody reach what their goal is, which is to extricate themselves from that risk, whether it's contractual or extra contractual risk. One of the things that I have continued to sort of learn and try to work on and have had the benefit of some amazing clients that are on this call with is that, yes, bad faith is a concern, but the way that we've been able to sort of maneuver through that concern is through open dialogue, and open dialogue with your insured before a mediation, during a mediation, going to a board meeting late at night when, they are available to answer questions about why you've written them this long reservation of rights, what it means in practical terms for them. And, the ability to meet people where they are, both from a lawyer and advocate standpoint, but I think also from a mediator standpoint, is really what we're getting down to here.
What is the moral of the Emperor's New Clothes? Bill, I'm interested to know what your answer is.
What my answer is? It's interesting. Hopefully, obviously, the goal of the presentation is to move to a point where everybody involved in litigated claims are looking to have expectations and reality be closer to one another. Get to that point where those two things maybe don't line up perfectly, but line up better than they have been. That's when you can really get cases resolved. I think we would be remiss in not saying that, we've all had those cases where somebody's absolutely trying to sell you invisible clothes. I think an awareness of it is good, but also a trust that if you can meet somebody genuinely, you're going to resolve more cases, you're going to help more clients, you're going to help your company more than if you look at everybody with that jaundiced eye. But some of you think I'm crazy, Jeff.
No, Bill, I just want to add to that. There are some people out there shopping for invisible clothes too. Those people we might characterize as clients with unrealistic expectations. And I'm sure it's never happened to anybody on this line because they're all very sophisticated lawyers, but perhaps it's happened to a friend. And this is what mediators can help with. A mediator can help a lawyer advise a client in the client's own interest that they've spent enough on this wardrobe of litigation tactics and it's time to stop, because the effort so far has brought the case to its maximum value. Further expenditures are not going to drive the settlement value of this case up very much or down very much, and not within the context of what it would cost to do it. And so allowing these communications to go forward between the sides and mediators helping to drive these points home can help lawyers with one of the biggest challenges they face in litigation, and that is through to their own clients and get unrealistic expectations down to planet Earth. Believe me, we are called upon very often to do that. Less commonly on the insurance carrier side because they evaluate claims and defenses for a living when you're an insurance claims professional, but it sometimes happens on the insurance carrier side, and it happens on the policyholder side and the third-party plaintiff side because those people are oftentimes very sophisticated in their own businesses, for example, but that doesn't mean they're very sophisticated in insurance coverage. And they may have unrealistic expectations about what their insurance covers. Mediators can help you with that, and that's why I put in the acid test question, will this mediator be able to get on wavelength with my client? Because you may need the mediator's help, you may want the mediator's help in breaking some bad news.
You couldn't be more spot on, and we've sat here and talked now for 55 minutes, believe it or not, about candor and about genuineness and reaching people where they are. That goes with your own client and frankly with your own lawyer as well. And I would encourage anybody on this call who works with our firm or any firm, you should be expecting a very honest and open assessment of risk, of what you can do and what you can't do. If your lawyers aren't giving you that honest assessment, if they're not telling you if you're going to lose or can lose, that's a problem, because especially in a setting like ours where we are largely paid by the hour, there is, I think, a temptation at some level to work hard, right? But working hard and spending money to no end isn't helpful at the end of the day. Working hard because you've had that open and honest conversation with your client about what their needs are, what their goals are, what their capabilities are, that's one thing. Working hard in the dark doesn't help anybody.
And I'm sure your insurance company clients, they'll say that they want you to shoot straight with them on the coverage or the liability issues on particular cases. And it's in your interest to do so, because after all, you're interested in a long-term relationship with that client, and you're not interested in overselling a weak case or a case with real problems, covering up the problems. Then you go to trial and a jury, get your head handed to you by a jury. That's no way to cement the relationship with could be a very important client.
Nobody likes surprises. What we're ultimately looking for is the top one, right? Not the bottom one here. We're looking for a way for people to know what they're going to experience to the best extent they can. You can't make promises about the way any case is going to go, but you can forecast what you see that's out there. And I have one of our oldest partners who used to tell us when we were young lawyers, they said nobody gets mad if you lose, they get mad if you don't tell them they're going to lose and then you lose. You like to win, but at the end of the day, it's having that sort of open and honest exchange that makes a lot of sense. I see we are at time limit. Jeff, if you want to take the final word here, I just want to say thank you for being a part of this presentation and everybody who showed up. I do get to secretly go back to the firm and gloat because I think we have the most participants at this one of any of our webinars thus far. So thanks to all of you who helped make that possible. And thanks specifically to you, Jeff, for being a part of it.
Well, Bill, thank you, first of all, for inviting me. All those late night taxi rides back to the airport from the various conferences we've attended. We've had conversations like this and about more personal things too. And it's nice to be able to deal with you in this context. I see Courtney, your partner, Courtney Britt, is on the line. And Courtney, I don't know if you have any words of wisdom to add to this?
No words of wisdom at this point. We do have a question that I wanted to pose before we get off with the group. So we've talked a lot, you and Bill, about the kind of thoughtful and purposeful communication that needs to happen during negotiation on these issues, and also the advance work that the parties often need to do. Sometimes despite that, however, things will get sideways and disagreements will develop during negotiations. And what I'd like to pose to you and Bill is, what steps would you encourage the parties to take in a situation where it looks like things are coming completely off the rails at one of these mediations? What have you found in your experience to be helpful for the lawyers or the insurer or the third-party plaintiff?
Bill, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I would say two things: patience and creativity. You know, you will get curveballs in cases, and when that happens, the worst thing that you can do is become irate and be like, well, this is all a complete waste of time, and now we're just going to go back to the mattresses. That doesn't help anyone. But, you know, taking a deep breath, grabbing lunch if you need to, getting the right people to discuss it with, you know, first and foremost is important. And then be creative. Look at what you have before you. Look at what you can accomplish. You know, sometimes what you can accomplish is an understanding that will encapsulate the risk, and then you go fight about what you have to fight about. Sometimes what you need to do is to sort of preach that patience to other people and think creatively about the next part of mediation and how to make that work. You know, ultimately, I think having people in the room, great mediators, for example, who can help to preach that patience and encourage creativity is what allows you to weather those storms, because they come up, and you know, sometimes they come up through nobody's fault. You know, somebody just reads something a different way at mediation. It's there. Sometimes it's a little bit more purposeful, but either way, you've got to be able to pivot.
Bill, those are all excellent thoughts. Let me add a few. First of all, an ounce of prevention is still worth a pound of cure. So what are some simple things you can do to prevent things from spinning out of control? Believe it or not, get a good night's sleep before the mediation. Be well rested. Have enough sleep. Have a good breakfast before the mediation. We're at home now for breakfast. You're not eating in your car. You're not eating in a hotel coffee shop. Have something with protein and healthy fats like avocado. Be hydrated. Have enough water with you, because, you know, we sit here for hours and hours, and I've got a ring light up there to illuminate me, and the room where I am in our house has a western exposure, so in the afternoons the sun can come baking in on me, and I can feel that sometimes I'm just getting dehydrated. So just making sure that you have a big glass of water with you can help to prevent these stresses from going on. If you feel a stressful moment, if you feel things are getting out of control, taking a break, as Bill said, is a great idea. If you're at home, as increasingly we are, I guess most of us are now, you don't have to go down an elevator and whatnot to get a breath of fresh air. You can take 10 steps and you can go out on your porch or your patio, get a breath of fresh air, you know, count to 10, stand up straight, savor good posture. That alone will help to reduce stress. Have a snack, have something with some protein in it, nuts, a piece of cheese, a little tub of yogurt, something like that. I know that this sounds ridiculously simple at one level. I know that. At the same time, it's so easy. When you come back from your break and you've gotten your fresh air, an attitude of curiosity, as Bill said. What is causing this impasse? What are you, there's some simple open-ended questions that if the mediator doesn't ask, you can be asking your client. A magic question. This seems to have you really upset. Yes, this has me very upset. And then ask the magic question, what part of it has you the most upset? If you ask what part of it has you the most upset, psychiatrists have explained to me that calls upon a different part of the brain. The non-emotional calls on your prefrontal cortex. Well, what are the parts that have me upset? How do I prioritize them? Which is most important to me? That simply asking a question that calls on a different part of the brain will help people calm down. And that question, you seem to be upset, angry, whatever, what part of it has you the most upset or angry can be great. Another great question is, what would you like to see happen right now? And you may get an answer like, well, my God, I want them to pay me $1 gazillion, or I want them to go away for nothing. And don't argue with it. The next question after that is, okay, what do you think we should do next to see if we can accomplish that result? And again, that's going to call on a different part of the brain. So the thing you shouldn't do is argue, because if you're arguing with your client, it's the chance of winning the argument. If you're a lawyer, winning an argument with your client, if you're a mediator, winning an argument with a lawyer or their client, the chances are very small. And if you succeed, you come away with a settlement which is more or less imposed on people rather than freely arrived at by people. And their satisfaction with it, the durability of it is going to be much less. And if our goals, among other things, are to have happy clients who will return to Teague, Campbell, or some of the, I know there are other law firms on the line too, people who will return to your law firm, lawyers who will make my phone ring again, or any mediator wants that. We want repeat business too. So to the extent we feel like we're bullying or arguing with people, it doesn't create good settlements, and it's not good for business either. I hope that answers the question.
I think definitely so. Thanks.
Let me thank you, Courtney, Bill, your whole team at Teague Campbell for inviting me. And Bill, I should mention that if questions do come to people later, they're welcome to reach out to me. My email is jk, my initials, jk@jeffkitchaven.com. My toll-free number is up there. I want to thank all the attendants, express my deep appreciation to all of you. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Jeff.